Aldrics Redemption. Paris, 1919. Colette Dubois found a script glowing softly in a moonlit cathedral, its words find peace in chaos, signed by Captain Henri Morel, as if the stone walls themselves were speaking. Chapter 1. Echoes in the empty cathedral. The air in the cathedral hung heavy with a scent of incense and dust, a ghostly perfume clinging to the remnants of prayers whispered long ago. Notre Dame, even scarred, even with her spire a gaping wound against the Parisian sky, held a majesty that defied the ravages of war. Colette Dubois walked slowly, her footsteps echoing in the vast, hollow space, the sound swallowed by the towering arches and stained glass windows that, miraculously, had survived. It was 1919, the year after the guns had fallen silent, but the silence felt heavier, more profound, than the thunder of artillery she'd grown accustomed to. Paris was rebuilding, but some wounds, Colette knew, went deeper than brick and mortar. She hadn't meant to come here. Churches, especially grand ones like this, had always felt distant. Too grand, too full of echoes of a faith she'd struggled to hold onto. But the chill November wind had driven her inside, and the sheer emptiness of the cathedral had a strange, magnetic pull. She was a nurse, had been for the last 4 years, stationed at a field hospital just outside of the city. She'd seen enough blood, enough shattered bodies, enough vacant stares to last a lifetime. And now, with the war over, she felt adrift. The constant urgency, the adrenaline, the sheer need to keep going had vanished, leaving behind a hollow ache she couldn't name. She ran a hand over the cool, smooth surface of a stone pillar, the worn carvings beneath her fingertips a testament to centuries of faith, of hope, of despair. The moonlight, filtering through a gap in the boarded-up windows, cast long, dancing shadows across the floor, illuminating patches of intricate mosaic that had somehow escaped the bombs. It was in one of these pools of silver light that she saw it. It wasn't a prayer book, or a discarded rosary, or anything she expected to find in a cathedral. It was a script, a small, leather-bound book, lying open on the cold stone floor as if it had been deliberately placed there. What drew her attention, though, wasn't the book itself, but the faint, ethereal glow that emanated from the open pages. It wasn't a reflection of the moonlight, it was a soft, internal luminescence, a pale, golden light that pulsed with a gentle rhythm. Colette hesitated, a shiver tracing its way down her spine. She glanced around the cathedral, half expecting to see someone, a priest perhaps, or a caretaker, but she was alone. The silence pressed in on her, broken only by the distant rumble of a passing motor car. She knelt, her stiff joints protesting the movement, and reached out a tentative hand. The air around the script felt strangely warm, a stark contrast to the chill of the cathedral. As her fingers brushed the leather cover, the glow intensified, and she could see the words written on the open page. It was a single sentence, penned in a bold, elegant script that seemed to dance in the otherworldly light. Find peace in chaos. Beneath the sentence, a signature, Captain Henri Morel. The name meant nothing to her. She wasn't expecting it to. Yet, the words resonated with a strange familiarity, a deep, aching chord struck within her soul. Find peace in chaos. It was the very thing she'd been searching for, the elusive calm in the storm of her own memories, in the wreckage of the world around her. She carefully picked up the script, the leather surprisingly supple beneath her touch. The glow didn't fade, if anything. It seemed to cling to her, a warm, comforting presence in the cold, vast emptiness. Who was Captain Henri Morel? And why had he left this script here, in this wounded cathedral? The question swirled in her mind, mingling with the lingering scent of incense and the echoes of unspoken prayers. She closed the script, the glow dimming slightly, but not disappearing entirely. It felt alive somehow, a secret waiting to be unlocked. She tucked the script into the pocket of her worn coat, the weight of it a strange comfort against her side. As she stood, a gust of wind rattled the boarded-up windows, a sound that echoed the turmoil within her. The war had taken so much from so many. It had taken her brother, Jean-Luc, lost somewhere in the mud of the Somme. It had taken her innocence, her belief in a world that made sense. It had left her with a gnawing emptiness, a fear that the peace she longed for would forever remain out of reach. But now, holding this strange, glowing script, a flicker of something new ignited within her. Curiosity, perhaps. A faint stirring of hope. A sense that this unexpected discovery might be a thread leading her out of the darkness. As she turned to leave, a single ray of moonlight pierced through a crack in the boarded-up windows, illuminating the stained glass image of Saint Michael, the archangel, vanquishing a demon. The image, bathed in the ethereal light, seemed to hold a silent promise. A promise of strength, of courage, of the possibility of finding light even in the deepest shadows. She would find Captain Henri Morel. She had to. The quiet cathedral and glowing message was an unexpected call she felt forced to follow. Something within her was pulling her to the man behind those moving words. Chapter 2. The Captain's Unsent Letter. The next morning, the gray Parisian light offered little warmth, mirroring the chill that had settled in Colette's heart since finding the script. The city was slowly waking, the sounds of street vendors hawking their wares, the rumble of early trams, a pale imitation of the vibrant pre-war bustle. Colette, however, found herself unable to join in the tentative return to normalcy. The script, nestled securely in her coat pocket, pulsed with a silent energy that kept her thoughts firmly anchored to the mystery it represented. She had a rare day off from the hospital, a small respite before returning to the endless stream of patient soldiers still suffering the lingering effects of gas attacks, civilians struggling with malnutrition and disease, the human debris of a conflict that refused to be neatly confined to the past. She decided to start her search at the Ministry of War, a sprawling, imposing building that held the records of every soldier who had served. The air inside the ministry was thick with the smell of paper and stale tobacco, a scent that instantly transported Colette back to the crowded field hospitals, the endless forms and requisitions, the constant struggle to keep track of the living and the dead. She approached a clerk, a thin, bespectacled man with a weary expression that seemed permanently etched onto his face. "I'm looking for information on a Captain Henri Morel," Colette said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I believe he served during the war." The clerk sighed, a sound that spoke volumes about the endless stream of inquiries he received. "Regiment? Unit? Any identifying information, mademoiselle?" Colette hesitated. She had nothing, only the name and the cryptic message from the script. I don't have that information. I found something belonging to him, and I'm trying to return it." The clerk raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident in his gaze. "Something? Mademoiselle, we have thousands of unclaimed belongings." Without more information, Colette pulled out the script, holding it out to the clerk. She didn't open it, reluctant to expose the strange glow to his scrutiny. "It's a book. A personal script. It's important to me that I find him." The clerk took the script, turning it over in his hands. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual about it, which both relieved and puzzled Colette. He opened the cover, glancing at the first few pages. "This is unusual. Not standard military issue, certainly." He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "There's no official record here, mademoiselle. No regimental markings, nothing to indicate weight." He stopped at the back of the script, where a small, almost hidden pocket was sewn into the binding. He reached inside and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, yellowed with age and stained with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. The ink was faded, but still legible. It was addressed to a Mademoiselle Sophie Delacroix, and the return address was simply Captain Henri Morel, 3rd Battalion, 17th Infantry Regiment, somewhere in France. "This might help," the clerk said, handing the letter to Colette. "The 17th Infantry, they saw heavy action near Verdun. A lot of casualties." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "If you find him, well, mademoiselle, prepare yourself. He may not be the man who wrote this." Colette took the letter, her fingers trembling. Verdun. The name conjured images of unimaginable horror, of a landscape churned into a bloody, muddy wasteland, of men reduced to shells of their former selves. She swallowed hard, a knot forming in her stomach. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. She left the ministry, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. The gray sky seemed to press down on her, the weight of the city, the weight of the war, almost unbearable. She found a small cafe, relatively empty at this early hour, and ordered a coffee, needing the warmth and the jolt of caffeine to clear her head. She unfolded the letter, her heart pounding in her chest. It was dated July 1916, during the height of the Battle of Verdun. "My dearest Sophie, the shelling never stops. It's a constant, deafening roar that echoes in your bones, even when you're huddled in a dugout, praying for it to end. I see things here, Sophie, things that no man should ever see. Boys, barely old enough to shave, torn apart by shrapnel. Men driven mad by the constant fear, the endless waiting. I try to hold on to hope, to believe that this will end someday, that we will return to a world where the sun shines and the birds sing, but it's getting harder. I carry your picture with me, tucked inside my uniform, close to my heart. It's the only thing that keeps me sane, the only reminder of the life we dreamed of, the life we promised each other. I dream of you, Sophie, of your smile, of your laughter, of the scent of lavender that always clings to your hair. I dream of the day when I can hold you in my arms again, when I can forget the horrors of this place. But I must be honest with you, my love. There's a darkness here, a darkness that seeps into your soul. I've seen good men do terrible things, driven by desperation, by the primal urge to survive. I fear that I'm changing, Sophie. That the man you loved is slowly being eroded by this war. I found some solace writing down thoughts and feelings. I haven't closed it with this letter. I hope to see you again. If I don't make it back, Sophie, know that I loved you with all my heart. Know that you were the light in my darkness, the reason I kept fighting. Forgive me, my love, for all the things I couldn't be, for all the promises I couldn't keep. Yours eternally, Henri. The letter ended abruptly, the last few lines blurred by what Colette now realized were tears, Henri's tears, mingled with the bloodstains. A wave of grief washed over her, a grief not just for Henri, but for Sophie, for all the lost loves, all the shattered dreams. She felt a profound connection to this man she had never met, a man who had poured out his heart in the midst of unimaginable horror. She carefully refolded the letter, placing it back in the script's hidden pocket. The glow from the pages seemed to pulse with a renewed intensity, as if acknowledging the weight of the words it contained. Colette knew then that her search for Captain Henri Morel was no longer just about returning a lost item. It was about something much deeper, something that touched the very core of her being. It was about finding answers, not just for Henri, but for herself. It was about understanding the darkness that the war had left behind and finding a way to navigate through it, to find peace, even in the midst of the lingering chaos. The mention of Sophie Delacroix gave a new target, a new face to search for to put together more pieces of this puzzle. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Lost Battalion. The name Sophie Delacroix haunted Colette. It was a name whispered on the wind, a ghost echoing in the chambers of her heart, inextricably linked to the enigmatic Captain Henri Morel. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that finding Sophie was the key to understanding Henri, to unlocking the secrets held within the glowing script. Her search began in the most obvious place, the Parisian address books. The city, though scarred, was meticulously documented, its inhabitants catalogued with a bureaucratic precision that had survived even the war. Colette spent hours poring over the heavy volumes, her eyes scanning the endless columns of names, her fingers tracing the faded ink. The Delacroix family was a common one, and she found dozens of entries, each one a potential lead, each one a potential dead end. She started with the addresses closest to Notre Dame, driven by an intuitive feeling that Sophie, like Henri, might have had some connection to the cathedral. She visited each address, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She spoke to elderly concierges, to shopkeepers who had been in the neighborhood for decades, to anyone who might remember a Sophie Delacroix. Most of the leads turned cold. Some Delacroix families had moved away, displaced by the war. Others had vanished, their names swallowed by the insatiable maw of the conflict. But one address, a small, unassuming building in the Marais district, yielded a flicker of hope. The concierge, a wizened woman with sharp eyes and a memory like a steel trap, remembered a Sophie Delacroix. Yes, Mademoiselle Delacroix. A lovely girl she was. Lived here with her mother, a seamstress. But it was before the war. They left, I believe, when the Germans, well, you know. Do you know where they went? Colette asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. The concierge shrugged. No one knows for sure. Some say they went to the countryside, to stay with relatives. Others, well, there were rumors. The Marais, it was a dangerous place during the war. Especially for she hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. Colette understood. The Marais had been a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, and the rumors the concierge alluded to were the whispers of deportations, of disappearances, of the horrors that had unfolded under the shadow of the occupation. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Had Sophie, like so many others, been swept away by the tide of hatred and violence? Do you remember anything else about her? Colette pressed, clinging to the last vestiges of hope. Anything at all? The concierge thought for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. She used to volunteer, I believe. At a hospital or a clinic, perhaps. Somewhere near the Place de Vosges. She was always a kind girl, Mademoiselle Delacroix. Always willing to help others. The Place de Vosges. It was another clue, a fragile thread leading Colette further into the labyrinth of the past. She thanked the concierge and left, the image of Sophie Delacroix, a kind, helpful girl, caught in the cross-currents of war firmly etched in her mind. She walked to the Place de Vosges, the elegant square, with its symmetrical arcades and red brick buildings, a haven of tranquility in the bustling city. She inquired at the local pharmacies, at the small clinics that dotted the neighborhood, asking about a Sophie Delacroix who might have volunteered during the war. Again, she encountered a wall of silence, of faded memories, of the reluctance to speak about the dark days of the occupation. But finally, at a small, unassuming clinic tucked away on a side street, she found someone who remembered. The clinic director, a middle-aged doctor with tired eyes and a gentle demeanor, listened patiently to Colette's story. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards a faded photograph on the wall, a group portrait of the clinic staff taken before the war. Sophie Delacroix, he said, his voice soft, tinged with sadness. Yes, I remember her. She volunteered here for a while, helping with the wounded, the refugees. She was a brave girl, Mademoiselle. Fearless, even. She had a special gift for comforting others, for bringing a sense of calm to the chaos. He pointed to the photograph. That's her there. In the second row, next to the nurse with the spectacles. Colette looked at the photograph, her heart aching. Sophie was young, barely more than a girl, with a radiant smile and bright, intelligent eyes. She looked vibrant, full of life, a stark contrast to the haunted faces that Colette had grown accustomed to seeing. What happened to her? Colette asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor sighed. She disappeared. One day, she simply didn't come to the clinic. We never heard from her again. There were rumors, of course, that she was involved with the resistance, that she was helping to smuggle Jewish families out of the city, that she was betrayed. The resistance. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Sophie hadn't just been a volunteer, she had been a fighter, a silent warrior in the struggle against the occupation. And Henri, had he known? Had he been part of the same network? Had their paths crossed in the shadowy world of espionage and resistance? The Lost Battalion, the doctor murmured, almost to himself. That's what they called them. The soldiers who fought in the shadows, the ones who never came home, the ones who vanished. The words sent a shiver down Colette's spine. The Lost Battalion. It was a phrase she'd heard whispered in the hospital, a legend, a myth, a testament to the courage and sacrifice of those who had fought in the darkness. And Henri, was he one of them? Was Sophie? The doctor had given her the name of a former resistance member, a woman. It was the only lead he could offer, a fragile thread. The weight of the unknown and all possible options for Henri and Sophie's fates hung heavy. Chapter 4. A Dance Among the Ruins. The address the doctor had given Colette was in Montmartre, a neighborhood perched high on a hill overlooking Paris, a place of artists and dreamers, of winding cobblestone streets and hidden courtyards. It was a world away from the sterile corridors of the Ministry of War, from the hushed whispers of the Marais. It was a place where secrets thrived, where the past clung to the present like ivy to ancient stone. The woman Colette was seeking, Madame Elise Dubois, no relation, lived in a small, slightly dilapidated building on the Rue Lepic, a street famous for its windmills and its bohemian atmosphere. The building's facade was covered in peeling paint and faded posters, a testament to its long and colorful history. Colette climbed the narrow, winding staircase, the scent of Gaulois cigarettes and old wood filling her nostrils. Madame Dubois' apartment was on the top floor, a small, cluttered space filled with books, paintings, and the remnants of a life lived on the edge. The woman herself was a striking figure, with fiery red hair streaked with gray, piercing blue eyes, and a presence that commanded attention. She was dressed in a flowing, bohemian-style dress, and a long, silver cigarette holder dangled from her fingers. "You're looking for information about Sophie Delacroix," Madame Dubois said, her voice raspy but strong, before Colette could even introduce herself. "The doctor from the Place de Vosges sent you, I presume." Colette nodded, taken aback by the woman's directness. "Yes. He said you might know something about her." Madame Dubois took a long drag from her cigarette, her eyes studying Colette intently. "Sophie was one of us," she said finally, her voice a low murmur. "A member of the resistance. A brave girl. Too brave, perhaps." She gestured for Colette to sit, and Colette settled into a worn armchair, the springs protesting beneath her weight. The room was filled with a hazy, blue smoke, the scent mingling with a faint aroma of lavender, a scent that instantly transported Colette back to Henri's letter, to his longing for Sophie. "What happened to her?" Colette asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Madame Dubois sighed, her gaze drifting towards a window that overlooked the rooftops of Paris. "She was betrayed," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Someone informed on her. The Gestapo, they took her. We never saw her again." The Gestapo. The name sent a chill down Colette's spine. She had heard the stories, the whispers of torture, of disappearances, of the unspeakable horrors that had unfolded in the hidden chambers of the Nazi secret police. She felt a wave of nausea, of overwhelming grief for Sophie, for this girl she had never met, but whose fate was now inextricably linked to her own. "Do you know who betrayed her?" Colette asked, her voice barely a whisper. Madame Dubois shook her head. "No." It was a time of secrets, of betrayals, of shifting alliances. Trust was a luxury we couldn't afford. Anyone could be an informer. A neighbor, a friend, even a lover. A lover. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Colette thought of Henri, of his letter, of his love for Sophie. Had he known about her involvement with the resistance? Had he been involved himself? And had he been the one who betrayed her? The thought was unbearable, a cruel twist of fate that threatened to shatter the fragile hope that had been building within her. "There was a man," Madame Dubois continued, her voice drawing Colette back to the present. "A soldier. Captain Henri Morel. He was close to Sophie. Very close." Colette's heart skipped a beat. "You knew him?" Madame Dubois nodded. "He was part of our network. He provided us with information, with supplies. He was a valuable asset." But she hesitated, her gaze darkening. "He was also complicated. He had his own demons, his own secrets." "What kind of secrets?" Colette pressed, her voice urgent. Madame Dubois shrugged. "The war, it changes people. It forces them to make choices, to compromise their values, to do things they never thought possible. Henri, he was haunted by something. Something he couldn't escape." "Do you think he betrayed Sophie?" Colette asked, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Madame Dubois looked at her, her blue eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding.
I don't know, she said.
I truly don't. But I know this. Henri loved Sophie. He loved her with a passion that consumed him. And he was devastated by her disappearance. He searched for her for months, risking his own life to find out what happened to her. He disappeared himself, not long after. Some say he was killed in action. Others say he went mad. That he was wandering the streets of Paris, a broken man, searching for a ghost. A broken man, searching for a ghost. The image resonated with Colette, with the emptiness she had felt in the cathedral, with the longing for peace that Henri had expressed in his script. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "For telling me this." Madame Dubois nodded. "Be careful, mademoiselle," she said, her voice warning. "The past, it has a way of clinging to you, of pulling you down. Don't let it consume you." Colette left the apartment, the scent of smoke and lavender clinging to her clothes. She walked down the Rue Lepic, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar. She felt lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The truth about Henri and Sophie remained elusive, shrouded in the fog of war, in the web of secrets and betrayals. As she reached the bottom of the hill, she saw a group of people gathered in a small, ruined square. They were dancing to the music of a lone accordion player. The music was slow, melancholic, a waltz that spoke of loss and longing. The dancers, mostly older couples, moved slowly, their faces etched with the scars of the war, but their eyes held a flicker of hope. Colette watched them, mesmerized. It was a strange, surreal scene, a dance among the ruins, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And in that moment, she realized something. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't bring back Sophie or Henri. But she could honor their memory. She could find a way to make peace with the chaos, to find her own way to dance among the ruins. The dance was a moment of beauty amidst the city and her mind's recovery, a moment of acceptance. This dance was an unexpected mirror to her own journey. Chapter 5. The Price of Silence. The days that followed Colette's visit to Madame Dubois were filled with a restless unease. The image of Henri, a broken man wandering the streets of Paris, haunted her dreams. The glowing script, tucked away in her drawer, seemed to pulse with a silent urgency, a constant reminder of the unanswered questions that gnawed at her soul. She returned to her work at the hospital, throwing herself into the routine of caring for the wounded, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the labyrinth of the past. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, she received a message. A note, delivered by a young boy who quickly vanished into the crowded streets. The note was unsigned, written in a hurried, almost frantic script. "Meet me.
Pont Neuf.
Midnight. I know about the captain. The Pont Neuf. The oldest bridge in Paris, a place of lovers' trysts, of secret rendezvous, of whispered promises. Midnight. The witching hour, the time when the veil between worlds was said to be thinnest, when ghosts walked and secrets were revealed." Colette hesitated, her instincts warning her of danger. This could be a trap, a lure to draw her into the shadowy world of espionage and betrayal. But the mention of Captain Henri Morel, the pull of the unanswered questions, was too strong to resist. She arrived at the Pont Neuf just before midnight. The bridge was deserted, shrouded in a mist that rose from the Seine, the gaslights casting an eerie, yellow glow on the ancient stones. The air was cold, damp, the silence broken only by the lapping of the water against the bridge's piers. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand resting on the small, silver pocketknife she carried for protection. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, tall and thin, his face hidden by the upturned collar of his coat. He walked with a slight limp, a subtle reminder of the war's lingering toll. As he approached, Colette recognized him. It was Jean-Pierre Dubois, a distant relative of Madame Elise. He used to bring messages and supplies to her for the hidden members during the war. "You came," he said, his voice low, barely audible above the sound of the river. "You said you knew about Captain Morel," Colette replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands.
Jean-Pierre nodded.
I knew him. We served together. In the Resistance. Madame Dubois told me he disappeared, Colette said. That he was searching for Sophie Delacroix. Jean-Pierre's gaze shifted, avoiding her eyes. He was obsessed with her, he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. He blamed himself for her disappearance. He believed he could have saved her. Did he betray her? Colette asked, the question she had been dreading, the question that had haunted her since her conversation with Madame Dubois. Jean-Pierre hesitated, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. No, he said, finally, his voice firm. Henri would never have betrayed Sophie. He loved her. More than life itself. Then who did?
Colette pressed.
Who informed on her? Jean-Pierre looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. It was complicated, he said. There were pressures.
Threats.
Blackmail. He paused, taking a deep breath. The Gestapo, they had someone on the inside. Someone close to us. Someone we trusted. Who? Colette asked, her voice urgent. Jean-Pierre hesitated again, his gaze darting around the deserted bridge, as if afraid of being overheard. It was Marcel Dubois, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Madame Elise's brother. Marcel Dubois. The name meant nothing to Colette. But the shock of Jean-Pierre's revelation was profound. Madame Elise's brother, a traitor. The woman who had spoken so eloquently about the resistance, about the courage and sacrifice of its members, had harbored a dark secret, a secret that had cost Sophie Delacroix her life.
Why?
Colette asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Why would he do that?
Jean-Pierre shrugged. He was weak, he said.
He had gambling debts. The Gestapo, they offered him money. A lot of money. Enough to escape.
To start a new life.
And Henri, did he know? Colette asked. Jean-Pierre shook his head.
No.
He never knew. He went to his grave believing it was someone else. Someone higher up. In the military. And Madame Elise? Colette asked. Does she know? Jean-Pierre looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding.
She knows, he said.
She's known all along. She protected him. She covered up his tracks. She silenced anyone who suspected the truth. The price of silence. Colette understood now. The weight of the secret, the burden of guilt, had consumed Madame Elise, had twisted her into a shadow of her former self. She had chosen to protect her brother, to preserve the illusion of his heroism, at the cost of Sophie's life, at the cost of Henri's sanity. Why are you telling me this now? Colette asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. Jean-Pierre looked at her, his gaze unwavering. Because it's time, he said. The war is over. The secrets, they need to be buried. And you deserve to know the truth. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was identical to the one Colette had found in the cathedral, except this one didn't glow. Henri gave this to me, he said. Before he disappeared. He wanted me to keep it safe. He said it contained his confession.
His story.
He handed the book to Colette.
Read it, he said.
It will explain everything. He turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had come. Colette was left alone on the bridge, the cold mist swirling around her, the weight of the second script heavy in her hands. 2 copies of a similar script, with different fates. The choice of which to open first weighed heavily on her. Chapter 6. Beneath a sky of scarred stars. The second script felt cold, inert in Colette's hands, a stark contrast to the warmth and pulsating glow of the one she had found in Notre Dame. It was a physical manifestation of the chasm between the Henri she had imagined, the romantic hero of a wartime tragedy, and the complex, flawed man Jean-Pierre had described. She returned to her small apartment, the streets of Paris silent and empty in the pre-dawn hours. She lit a single candle, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls, and sat down at her small, wooden table. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover of the second script. What secrets would it reveal? What darkness would it expose? She took a deep breath and opened it. The script was written in the same elegant hand as the first, but the ink was faded, the pages stained with what looked like watermarks, perhaps tears. The first few entries were similar to the glowing script, descriptions of the horrors of Verdun, of Henry's longing for Sophie, of his growing disillusionment with the war. But as Colette read on, the tone began to change. July 28, 1916, the shelling never stops. I see ghosts everywhere. The faces of the men I've lost, the men I've killed. I try to hold onto Sophie's image, to her memory, but it's fading, like a photograph exposed to too much light. I fear I'm losing myself, Sophie. I fear I'm becoming someone you wouldn't recognize. August 12, 1916, I met a man today, a prisoner, a German soldier. He was young, barely older than Jean-Luc. He was wounded, terrified, his eyes filled with the same fear I see in my own men. I couldn't kill him. I couldn't pull the trigger. I let him go. I know it was wrong, a betrayal of my duty, but I couldn't do it. I'm starting to question everything, Sophie. Everything I believe in. September 5th, 1916, I received a letter from you today. Your words, they were like a lifeline, a reminder of the world beyond this hell. You wrote about the flowers blooming in the Tuileries gardens, about the children playing in the streets, about the hope for a future where we could be together again. I cling to that hope, Sophie, but it's getting harder. I see too much darkness, too much hatred. I fear it's consuming me. October 18th, 1916, they are saying I am a hero for saving my men in the last attack. It's a lie, a hollow charade. I found out something today. Something terrible. Something that shatters everything. I learned about Marcel. About his betrayal. I don't know what to do. I can't believe it. Sophie, my God. Sophie. The entries stopped abruptly after that. There were several blank pages, followed by a single, short sentence, written in a shaky, almost illegible hand. I can't live with this. Colette closed the script, her hands trembling. The weight of Henry's despair, his anguish, was almost unbearable. She understood now. He hadn't disappeared because he was searching for Sophie. He had disappeared because he couldn't live with the knowledge of her betrayal, with the guilt of his own perceived failures. She reached for the glowing script, the one she had found in the cathedral. She opened it, the soft, golden light a welcome contrast to the darkness of the second script. She turned to the last page, to the inscription that had drawn her into this mystery in the first place. Find peace in chaos. Beneath the inscription, there was another entry, written in the same elegant hand, but in a different ink, a brighter, more vibrant blue. It was dated November 11th, 1918, the day the armistice was signed, the day the guns finally fell silent. November 11th, 1918, the war is over. But the battle within me, it rages on. I've wandered for months, a ghost among the living, searching for a way to escape the darkness. I came to this cathedral, to this place of peace, hoping to find some solace, some forgiveness. I saw a woman today, a nurse, tending to the wounded, to the forgotten. She had kind eyes, a gentle touch. She reminded me of you, Sophie, of the goodness that still exists in the world, even after all the horror. I don't know if I can ever find peace, Sophie. But I know this. I can't let the darkness win. I have to keep fighting. For you, for the memory of the man I once was, for the hope of a future I may never see. I will find a way to live, to honor your sacrifice, to make amends for my own failings. I will find a way to find peace in chaos. Colette closed the glowing script, tears streaming down her face. The two scripts, side by side, told a complete story, a story of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, of the enduring power of the human spirit. Henri hadn't found peace in death. He had found it in life, in the quiet courage of a nurse, in the flickering flame of hope that refused to be extinguished. The two different endings were a shocking revelation, especially the final entry in the glowing script. She will meet him. She knows it. Chapter 7. The Spy's Confession. The revelation that Henri was alive, that he had somehow found a measure of peace after the war, filled Colette with a renewed sense of purpose. The glowing script, with its final, hopeful entry, was a beacon, guiding her through the darkness, urging her to continue her search. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she would find him. The question was where to start. She returned to the hospital, but her focus had shifted. She was no longer just a nurse, tending to the physical wounds of her patients. She was a detective, searching for clues, for any trace of the man who had haunted her dreams. She began to pay closer attention to the older patients, the men who had served in the war, the ones who carried the invisible scars of the conflict. She listened to their stories, their ramblings, their fragmented memories of battles fought and lost, of comrades who had fallen, of the horrors they had witnessed. She searched their faces, their eyes, for any flicker of recognition, any sign that they might have known Captain Henri Morel. Most of the leads turned cold. The war had taken its toll, leaving many men with shattered minds, their memories a jumble of fragmented images and half-forgotten names. But one patient, an elderly man named Monsieur Dubois, no relation to Madame Elise or Jean-Pierre, who had been a medic in the 17th Infantry Regiment, offered a glimmer of hope. He was a quiet, unassuming man, his body frail, his voice barely a whisper. He suffered from recurring nightmares, reliving the horrors of Verdun, the constant shelling, the screams of the wounded, the stench of death. But in his lucid moments, he had a sharp mind, a remarkable memory for detail. Colette had been tending to him for several weeks, listening patiently to his stories, offering him comfort and companionship. One evening, as she was preparing to leave, he reached out and grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Mademoiselle," he said, his voice raspy but urgent. I remember him. Captain Morel." Colette's heart skipped a beat. "You knew him?" Monsieur Dubois nodded. "He was a good man, a brave officer, but he was haunted by something he couldn't escape." "The woman," Colette said. "Sophie Delacroix." Monsieur Dubois' eyes widened in surprise. "You know about her?" "I know some of it," Colette replied. "I know she was in the resistance, that she was betrayed." Monsieur Dubois closed his eyes, his face contorted in pain. "It was a terrible time," he whispered. "So many secrets, so many lies, so much betrayal." "Jean-Pierre Dubois told me it was Marcel Dubois who informed on her," Colette said, her voice steady. Monsieur Dubois opened his eyes, his gaze locking onto Colette's. "Jean-Pierre, he knows the truth," he said. "But he doesn't know everything." "What do you mean?" Colette asked, her voice urgent. Monsieur Dubois hesitated, his gaze darting around the room, as if afraid of being overheard. "There was another player," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Someone higher up. Someone who manipulated Marcel. Someone who profited from the betrayal." "Who?" Colette pressed. "Who was it?" Monsieur Dubois took a deep breath, his chest rattling with the effort. "It was a British officer," he said. "A liaison officer. Attached to our regiment. He was a spy. Working for both sides." "A British officer.
A spy.
Working for both sides." The revelation sent a shockwave through Colette. It was a twist she hadn't anticipated, a betrayal that went far beyond the personal, that touched the very foundations of the alliance between France and Britain. "What was his name?" Colette asked, her voice trembling. Monsieur Dubois struggled to speak, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "His name was Captain Alistair Cunningham," he whispered. He was the one. He used Marcel. He betrayed Sophie. Captain Alistair Cunningham. The name meant nothing to Colette, but the implications of Monsieur Dubois' confession were staggering. A British officer, a trusted ally, had been responsible for Sophie's death, for Henry's torment, for the web of secrets and lies that had consumed so many lives. And Henri, did he know? Colette asked. Monsieur Dubois shook his head.
No.
He never knew. He blamed himself. He thought it was his fault. He coughed, a deep, racking cough that shook his frail body. He was a good man, he whispered, his voice fading. He deserved better. Monsieur Dubois closed his eyes, his breathing becoming shallow and irregular. Colette realized he was slipping away. She called for a doctor, but it was too late. The old man died peacefully in his sleep, his secrets finally revealed, his burden finally lifted. Colette was left alone with the weight of his confession, with the knowledge that the truth was far more complex, far more insidious than she had ever imagined. She had found another piece of the puzzle, but it had only deepened the mystery, raised more questions than it answered. Captain Alistair Cunningham, a man of power. How would this change her search? How will she get to him? A probable man of resources. Chapter 8. Scars that never fade. The death of Monsieur Dubois, with his deathbed confession about Captain Alistair Cunningham, left Colette reeling. The image of a British officer, a supposed ally, betraying Sophie and manipulating events for his own gain was a bitter pill to swallow. It added another layer of complexity to an already tangled web of deceit and wartime intrigue. She needed to find out more about Cunningham, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. He was likely a man of influence, protected by layers of secrecy and officialdom. She decided to start by revisiting the Ministry of War, hoping to find some record of Cunningham's service, some clue that might lead her to him. The clerk she had spoken to before, the one who had helped her find Henry's letter to Sophie, recognized her immediately. Mademoiselle Dubois, he said, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Back again? Still searching for Captain Morel? Not exactly, Colette replied. I'm looking for information on another officer. A British officer. Captain Alistair Cunningham. The clerk's expression changed, a subtle shift from weary resignation to cautious curiosity. Cunningham, he repeated, his voice low. That's an unusual request. What makes you think he was connected to the French forces? Colette hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I have reason to believe he was a liaison officer, attached to the 17th Infantry Regiment, during the Battle of Verdun. The clerk's eyebrows rose. Verdun, he murmured. That's sensitive information, mademoiselle. Records from that period, they're not always readily accessible. I understand, Colette said. But it's important. It's a matter of justice. The clerk studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing. He seemed to sense the urgency in her voice, the determination in her eyes. He sighed, then nodded. Come with me, he said. He led her through a maze of corridors, deeper into the bowels of the ministry, to a section she hadn't seen before. It was a smaller, more secure area, filled with locked filing cabinets and heavy, steel doors. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old paper, a scent that spoke of secrets and forgotten histories. The clerk unlocked one of the filing cabinets and began to search, his fingers flipping through the yellowed files. After what seemed like an eternity, he pulled out a thin, unassuming folder. Cunningham, Alistair, he said, reading the label. Captain. British Army. Liaison Officer. 17th Infantry Regiment. Verdun. He handed the folder to Colette. You can look at it here, he said. But you can't take it with you. And be discreet, mademoiselle. Some information it's best left buried. Colette took the folder, her hands trembling slightly. She sat down at a small, wooden table and opened it. The file contained a few basic documents: Cunningham's service record, a brief summary of his duties as a liaison officer, a list of commendations for bravery. There was nothing that immediately stood out, nothing that hinted at his duplicity, his betrayal. But then, tucked away at the back of the file, she found a photograph. It was a group portrait of several officers, taken during the Battle of Verdun. Colette recognized some of the faces. Henri Morel, looking young and haunted Marcel Dubois, his expression smug and arrogant, and standing next to Marcel, a tall, handsome man with a confident smile and piercing blue eyes, Captain Alistair Cunningham. Colette studied Cunningham's face, searching for any sign of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. He looked charming, charismatic, the epitome of a British officer and gentleman. But there was something in his eyes, a coldness, a hint of cruelty, that sent a shiver down her spine. She continued to search through the file, hoping to find some evidence, some confirmation of Cunningham's treachery. But there was nothing. No mention of his involvement with the resistance, no hint of his double-dealing. It was as if he had erased all traces of his crimes, leaving behind only a carefully constructed facade of heroism and duty. She closed the file, a feeling of frustration and disappointment washing over her. She had found Cunningham, but she was no closer to proving his guilt, to bringing him to justice. She thanked the clerk and left the ministry. The image of Cunningham's face burned into her memory. As she walked, a thought struck her. Cunningham was a spy, a master of deception. He wouldn't have left any obvious clues, any incriminating evidence in his official file. He would have hidden his secrets elsewhere, in a place where no one would think to look. And then she remembered. Monsieur Dubois, the medic, had mentioned that Cunningham was working for both sides. That meant he must have had contact with the Germans. He must have left some trace of his activities in their records. The German archives. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it was the only lead she had left. She knew it would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to gain access to those records. They were likely still classified, locked away in some vault, guarded by layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. But some soldiers, some French intelligence officers, must be able to help her. The shift to the German archives was daunting and potentially dangerous. Chapter 9. The Secret of the Catacombs. The idea of accessing German archives, especially in the still fragile peace of 1919 Paris, seemed almost insurmountable. Colette knew she couldn't simply walk into a government building and demand to see classified documents. She needed help, someone with connections, someone who understood the shadowy world of intelligence and espionage. She thought of Jean-Pierre Dubois, but he had already risked enough, and she was reluctant to drag him further into danger. Then she remembered Madame Elise, the resistance leader. Despite her brother's betrayal, Madame Elise had been a formidable figure in the fight against the occupation. She had contacts, resources, a network of informants that stretched across the city, perhaps even beyond. Colette hesitated, unsure whether she could trust the woman, given her complicity in covering up Marcel's crimes. But she had no other choice. She returned to Montmartre, to Madame Elise's apartment on the Rue Lepic. The woman greeted her with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Mademoiselle Dubois," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "What brings you back here? Have you found your Captain Morel?"
"I'm closer," Colette replied.
"But I need your help. I need to access German archives." Madame Elise's eyes widened, her expression shifting from suspicion to alarm. "German archives?" she repeated. "That's impossible. Those records are sealed. Classified." "I know," Colette said. "But there's something I need to find. Something related to Sophie's betrayal. Something that implicates a British officer." Madame Elise's gaze sharpened, her eyes boring into Colette's. "A British officer?" she said, her voice low. "Who?" Colette hesitated, then took a deep breath.
"Captain Alistair Cunningham," she said.
The name seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Madame Elise's face paled, her hand flying to her throat. "Cunningham," she whispered. "You know about Cunningham?"
"I know he was a spy," Colette said.
"Working for both sides. That he betrayed Sophie." Madame Elise sank into a chair, her body trembling. How did you find out?" Colette told her about Monsieur Dubois, the medic, and his deathbed confession. She explained her visit to the Ministry of War, the photograph she had found, her realization that Cunningham must have left some trace of his activities in the German records. Madame Elise listened in silence, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. When Colette finished, she sighed, a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years of secrets and regrets. "Cunningham," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a devil. A charming devil. He seduced us all. With his promises, his lies, his power." "Did you know he was working for the Germans?" Colette asked. Madame Elise shook her head.
"No.
Not at first. We thought he was one of us. A trusted ally. He provided us with information, with weapons, he helped us save lives. But he also took lives," Colette said, her voice hard. Madame Elise nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered.
"He did.
He used us. He used Sophie. He destroyed everything." She paused, taking a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. I can't help you access the official archives, she said. It's too dangerous. Too many people want to keep those secrets buried. But there might be a way to locate some information without needing the sealed archives. But there is another way, she continued, her voice gaining strength. A secret archive. Hidden beneath the city. A secret archive? Colette repeated, her heart pounding with anticipation. Madame Elise nodded. The catacombs, she said. The tunnels beneath Paris. They were used by the resistance. To hide weapons, to shelter refugees, to store documents.
Secrets.
The catacombs. Colette had heard of them, of course. The vast network of underground tunnels, the ossuaires filled with the bones of millions of Parisians, a labyrinth of darkness and death. It was a place of legends, of whispers, of hidden histories. There's a section, Madame Elise continued, known only to a few, where we kept records, documents that couldn't fall into enemy hands. It's possible Cunningham's name might be there. Some mention of his activities. How do we get there? Colette asked, her voice urgent. Madame Elise smiled, a flicker of her old fire returning to her eyes.
I know someone, she said.
Someone who knows the catacombs like the back of his hand.
A guide.
A smuggler. A ghost. She reached for a small, silver bell on her table and rang it. A few moments later, a man appeared from a hidden doorway, a shadowy figure, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He was tall and thin, with a silent, almost ethereal presence. This is Jacques, Madame Elise said. He will take you there. He will show you the way. Jacques nodded, his eyes, barely visible beneath the brim of his hat, studying Colette intently. He didn't speak, but his gaze seemed to penetrate her soul, to assess her worthiness, her courage. Are you ready? Madame Elise asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Colette took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She was about to descend into the darkness, into the bowels of the city, into a world of secrets and forgotten histories. She was about to face her fears, to confront the ghosts of the past. She was going to travel underground, into the maze of the catacombs. It was a scary place, filled with its own mysteries. Yes, she said, her voice firm. I'm ready. Chapter 10. A promise etched in moonlight. The descent into the catacombs was like stepping into another world. The air grew instantly cooler, damper, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The sounds of the city faded away, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water and the soft, shuffling footsteps of Jacques, their silent guide. Colette followed him through a maze of narrow, winding tunnels, the walls lined with neatly stacked bones, the skulls staring out at her with empty sockets, a silent testament to the city's long and often brutal history. She felt a sense of unease, of claustrophobia, a primal fear of being buried alive. But she pressed on, driven by her determination to find the truth, to uncover the secrets that lay hidden in this subterranean world. Jacques moved with a silent grace, his feet barely making a sound on the stone floor. He seemed to know every twist and turn of the labyrinth, navigating the darkness with an uncanny ease. He carried a single lantern, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the macabre spectacle of the ossuaires. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a section of the catacombs that was different from the rest. The bones were gone, replaced by rough-hewn stone walls, reinforced with wooden beams. There were signs of recent habitation, discarded crates, empty bottles, the remnants of a campfire. This was clearly a place where people had lived, had hidden, had sought refuge from the world above. Jacques stopped in front of a seemingly blank wall. He ran his hand over the stone, feeling for something, a hidden mechanism, a secret passage. Colette watched him, her heart pounding with anticipation. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the presence of the ghosts who had sought shelter in this place, the echoes of their hopes and fears. With a soft click, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow opening. Jacques gestured for Colette to enter, and she stepped through, into a small, hidden chamber. The room was filled with dusty crates and wooden boxes, stacked haphazardly against the walls. There were shelves lined with books and papers, yellowed with age, covered in a thick layer of dust. This was the secret archive, the repository of forgotten histories, of hidden truths. "Search," Jacques said, his voice a low murmur, the first words he had spoken since they had entered the catacombs. "Find what you seek." He turned and left, disappearing back into the labyrinthine tunnels, leaving Colette alone in the silence of the hidden chamber. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She had found the archive, but now the real work began. She had to sift through the mountains of documents to find some mention of Captain Alistair Cunningham, some evidence of his betrayal. She began to search, opening boxes, unfolding papers, scanning the faded ink, her eyes straining in the dim light of the lantern. She found records of resistance activities, lists of names, coded messages, maps of escape routes, reports on enemy movements. She found stories of courage and sacrifice, of heroism and betrayal, of the ordinary people who had risked their lives to fight for freedom. Hours passed, and Colette continued to search, her fingers growing numb, her eyes aching, her body weary. She found nothing, no mention of Cunningham, no hint of his duplicity. She began to despair, to fear that she had come all this way for nothing, that the truth would remain forever buried in the darkness. But then, as she was about to give up, she found a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner of the room. It was different from the other boxes, more ornate, with a carved inscription on the lid, "Veritas Vincit Truth Conquers." She carefully opened the box, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Inside, she found a collection of letters, bound together with a faded ribbon. The letters were written in French, in a familiar, elegant hand. It was Henry's handwriting. She unfolded the first letter, her fingers trembling. It was dated July 1917, a year after Sophie's disappearance. "My dear Sophie, I know you're gone, but I can't stop writing to you. It's the only way I can keep you alive. The only way I can make sense of this madness. I've been searching for answers, Sophie, for the truth about what happened to you. I've followed every lead, every rumor, every whisper, and I've finally found it. It wasn't Marcel. He was a pawn, a tool. The real traitor was someone else. Someone I trusted. Someone I admired. His name is Captain Alistair Cunningham, a British officer.
A spy.
Working for both sides. He used you, Sophie. He betrayed you. He killed you." The letter continued, detailing Cunningham's treachery, his manipulation of Marcel, his involvement with the Germans, his cold-blooded betrayal of Sophie. Henri had pieced together the puzzle, had uncovered the truth, but it had come too late. He had been unable to save Sophie, unable to prevent her death. The final letter was dated November 10th, 1918, the day before the armistice. "My dear Sophie, tomorrow, the war will end. But my war, it will never end. I will carry your memory with me, always. I will avenge you, Sophie. I will expose Cunningham. I will make him pay. I have found peace knowing the truth, my love. Soon, I will be free to join you, wherever that may be. I love you, Sophie. Always." Henri. Colette looked up, seeing the faded ink. Colette closed the box, tears streaming down her face. Henry's letters were a confession, a testament to his love for Sophie, his grief, his rage, his determination to find justice. He had found the truth, but it had destroyed him. A promise in faded writing, and a promise with a glowing presence. She would fulfill that promise. She looked up, as if staring at Henri, at the moonlight in her room. She would honor his memory, and seek the peace he wanted. Chapter 11. Betrayal at the Grand Hotel. Armed with Henry's letters, Colette knew what she had to do. She had to expose Cunningham, to bring him to justice, to avenge Sophie's death and Henry's shattered life. But she also knew it wouldn't be easy. Cunningham was a powerful man, protected by his position, his connections, his carefully constructed facade of heroism. She needed a plan, a way to confront him, to force him to confess his crimes. She decided to use the upcoming Armistice Day celebrations as her opportunity. Paris was preparing for a grand commemoration, a day of remembrance and celebration, a day to honor the fallen and to mark the end of the war. Dignitaries from all over the world would be attending, including, Colette learned, Captain Alistair Cunningham, now a decorated war hero, a celebrated figure in British society. The main event was to be held at the Grand Hotel, a lavish, opulent establishment that had served as a headquarters for Allied officers during the war. It was a place of luxury and privilege, a world away from the trenches and the battlefields, from the suffering and the sacrifice of ordinary soldiers. It was the perfect setting for Colette's confrontation with Cunningham, a place where his carefully crafted facade would be most vulnerable. She spent days preparing, meticulously planning every detail. She knew she couldn't simply accuse Cunningham publicly. She needed proof, evidence that would withstand scrutiny, that would expose his lies and his treachery. She revisited the Ministry of War, using her newfound knowledge to persuade the clerk to grant her access to Cunningham's complete file, including the classified sections. She discovered that Cunningham had been awarded several medals for bravery, including a Victoria Cross, the highest honor in the British military. But she also found discrepancies, inconsistencies in his reports, gaps in his timeline, hints of a hidden agenda. She gathered copies of these documents, carefully compiling a dossier that would serve as her weapon against him. She also reached out to Jean-Pierre Dubois, the former resistance member who had revealed Marcel's betrayal. She needed his help, his testimony, to corroborate Henry's letters and to expose Cunningham's involvement with the Germans. Jean-Pierre was reluctant at first, still haunted by the past, by the fear of reprisal. But Colette persuaded him, convincing him that it was time for the truth to be revealed, that it was the only way to honor Sophie's memory and to find justice for Henri. On the day of the Armistice Day celebrations, Colette dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant black dress, a symbol of mourning and remembrance. She tucked Henry's letters, along with the copies of Cunningham's file, into a small, discreet handbag. She felt a mixture of fear and determination, of grief and resolve. She was about to walk into a lion's den, to confront a powerful and dangerous man. But she was ready. The Grand Hotel was a scene of extravagant celebration. The lobby was filled with dignitaries, military officers, and elegantly dressed women, all mingling and chatting, champagne glasses clinking, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and music. Colette moved through the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces, searching for Cunningham. She finally spotted him, standing near a group of British officers, his tall, handsome figure dominating the scene. He was laughing, his blue eyes sparkling, his charm and charisma on full display. He looked untouchable, a man above reproach, a hero. Colette took a deep breath and approached him. As she drew closer, he noticed her, his gaze shifting from his companions to her. He smiled, a polite, condescending smile, the smile of a man who is used to being admired, to being obeyed. "Mademoiselle," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Can I help you?" "Captain Cunningham," Colette replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I need to speak with you. Privately." Cunningham's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even suspicion, crossing his face. "I'm afraid I'm rather busy at the moment," he said. "Perhaps later. It's about Sophie Delacroix," Colette said, her voice low but firm. The name seemed to hang in the air, a sudden chill in the midst of the celebratory atmosphere. Cunningham's eyes widened, his face paling slightly. He glanced around, as if assessing the situation, calculating his options. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice still smooth, but with a hint of steel beneath the surface. "I think you do," Colette replied. "I know about your involvement with the resistance, about your betrayal." She reached into her handbag and pulled out Henry's letters. "These were written by Captain Henri Morel," she said. "He knew the truth. He knew what you did." Cunningham's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on the letters. He didn't speak, but his face was a mask of barely controlled rage. "He loved Sophie," Colette continued. "And you used her. You betrayed her. You killed her." Cunningham finally found his voice. "You have no proof," he said, his voice a low growl. "These letters, they mean nothing. They're the ravings of a madman." "I have other proof," Colette said. She pulled out the copies of Cunningham's file, the documents that revealed the discrepancies, the inconsistencies, the hints of his double-dealing. "And I have a witness," she added. "Someone who knows the truth. Someone who was there." She signaled to Jean-Pierre Dubois, who had been waiting in the shadows. He stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. He looked at Cunningham, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and sadness. "It's true," Jean-Pierre said, his voice trembling slightly. "You betrayed Sophie. You sold her to the Germans." Cunningham stared at Jean-Pierre, his face contorted in a mask of fury and desperation. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny the accusations, but no words came out. He was trapped, exposed, his carefully crafted facade shattered. The surrounding guests began to stare, to whisper, to sense that something was amiss. The celebratory atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a sense of unease, of suspicion. Cunningham's carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. He would be cornered, his lies exposed. His career and image instantly ruined. Chapter 12. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The scene in the Grand Hotel, with Cunningham's carefully constructed world collapsing around him, created a ripple of shock and disbelief among the assembled guests. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to outright stares, as the truth about the celebrated war hero began to unravel. Cunningham, his face a mask of fury and desperation, tried to maintain his composure, to deny the accusations, but his words rang hollow, his denials unconvincing. "This is absurd," he sputtered, his voice losing its characteristic smoothness, its cultured veneer. "These are lies. Fabrications. I don't know what this woman is talking about." But Colette stood firm, her gaze unwavering, her voice calm and resolute. She held up Henry's letters, the damning evidence of Cunningham's treachery. "These letters were written by a man who loved Sophie Delacroix," she said. "A man who knew the truth. A man you destroyed." She turned to Jean-Pierre Dubois, who stood beside her, his presence a silent testament to Cunningham's guilt.
"Tell them," she said.
"Tell them what you saw. Tell them what you know." Jean-Pierre hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with fear, with the lingering trauma of the past. But then he took a deep breath and spoke, his voice trembling slightly, but gaining strength with each word. "It's true," he said. "Captain Cunningham, he was a spy, working for both sides. He used us. He used Sophie. He betrayed her to the Germans." He recounted the events of that terrible time, the secrets, the betrayals, the constant fear of discovery. He described Cunningham's charm, his manipulation, his ability to deceive even those who thought they knew him best. He spoke of Sophie's bravery, her unwavering commitment to the resistance, her tragic fate. As Jean-Pierre spoke, a hush fell over the room. The guests, initially shocked and disbelieving, began to listen, to absorb the weight of his words, to understand the depth of Cunningham's treachery. The celebratory atmosphere had completely dissipated, replaced by a sense of somber reflection, of shared grief and outrage. Cunningham, sensing the tide turning against him, tried to interrupt, to discredit Jean-Pierre, to sow doubt in the minds of the listeners. But his efforts were futile. The truth was out, and it was undeniable. "You're lying," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're all lying. This is a conspiracy. A plot to ruin me." But no one believed him. His carefully crafted facade had crumbled, revealing the monster that lurked beneath. He was exposed, his crimes laid bare for all to see. Colette stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Cunningham. "You took everything from Sophie," she said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Her life, her dreams, her future. And you broke Henry's heart. You drove him to madness. You destroyed him." She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. "But you won't get away with it," she continued. "You won't escape justice. You will pay for what you did." Cunningham stared at her, his face a mask of defeat and despair. He knew he was finished. His career, his reputation, his carefully constructed life lay in ruins. He had been exposed, his secrets revealed, his crimes brought to light. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer a final, desperate denial, but no words came out. He simply stood there, silent, defeated, a broken man. The silence was broken by the arrival of several military police officers, alerted by the commotion. They approached Cunningham, their faces grim, their expressions conveying the gravity of the situation. They placed him under arrest, informing him of the charges against him: espionage, treason, complicity in the murder of a French national. As Cunningham was led away, his head bowed in shame, a murmur of shock and disbelief rippled through the crowd. The celebrated war hero, the decorated officer, had been unmasked as a traitor, a murderer, a betrayer of everything he had claimed to stand for. Colette watched him go, her heart heavy with a mixture of grief and satisfaction. She had found justice for Sophie, for Henri, for all those who had suffered at Cunningham's hands. But the victory felt hollow, the pain of the past still raw and aching. The unspoken words between all parties in the room said more than what was put into the record. The weight of the silence in those moments was crushing. She looked up at Jean-Pierre. The two people who brought Cunningham down. Chapter 13. Across the barricades of the heart. The aftermath of Cunningham's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. The news spread like wildfire through Paris, then across Europe, causing a sensation, a scandal that threatened to destabilize relations between France and Britain. Colette found herself at the center of the storm, besieged by journalists, questioned by investigators, hailed as a heroine by some, vilified by others. She tried to retreat from the public eye, to seek refuge in the quiet routine of her work at the hospital. But the events of the past few months had changed her, had transformed her from a grieving nurse into a determined seeker of justice, a woman who had faced her fears and confronted the darkness of the past. She could no longer simply tend to the physical wounds of her patients. She felt a deeper responsibility, a need to help them heal their emotional scars, to find peace in the midst of the lingering chaos of the war. She also found herself drawn to Jean-Pierre Dubois, the former resistance member who had stood by her side, who had helped her expose Cunningham's treachery. They shared a bond, a connection forged in the crucible of shared experience, of shared grief and shared triumph. They spent hours talking, sharing their stories, their memories, their hopes and fears. Colette learned more about Jean-Pierre's past, about his involvement in the resistance, about the sacrifices he had made, the losses he had endured. She discovered that he was a kind, compassionate man, haunted by the horrors he had witnessed, but still clinging to a belief in the goodness of humanity. He, in turn, learned about Colette's life, about her brother's death in the Somme, about her struggles to find meaning and purpose in a world shattered by war. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering determination to find justice for Sophie and Henri. They found solace in each other's company, a sense of understanding and acceptance that transcended words. They were two wounded souls, drawn together by the shared trauma of the past, finding healing and hope in their connection. One evening, as they were walking along the Seine, the lights of Paris reflecting on the water, Jean-Pierre turned to Colette, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and vulnerability. "Colette," he said, his voice hesitant, I know this is not the time, not the place, but I need to tell you I care for you.
Deeply.
Colette was taken aback, her heart pounding in her chest. She had sensed a growing affection between them, a subtle shift in their relationship from comrades in arms to something more. But she had been afraid to acknowledge it, afraid to open her heart to the possibility of love, after all the loss and pain she had endured. "Jean-Pierre," she said, her voice trembling slightly, I care for you too. But I'm afraid.
I'm still haunted by the past.
By Henri. By Sophie. Jean-Pierre nodded, his gaze understanding.
I know, he said.
I understand. The past, it casts a long shadow. It's hard to escape. I feel like I'm betraying them, Colette continued. By moving on. By finding happiness. Jean-Pierre reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a warm shiver through her. "You're not betraying them," he said. "You're honoring their memory. By living. By loving. By finding peace." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "Henri, he wanted you to find peace," he said. He wrote it in his script. "Find peace in chaos." Colette remembered the glowing script, the message that had drawn her into this journey, the message that had ultimately led her to Jean-Pierre. She realized that he was right. Henri wouldn't want her to remain trapped in the past, consumed by grief and regret. He would want her to live, to love, to find happiness. But what about Sophie?
Colette asked.
What about his love for her?
Jean-Pierre smiled, a sad, knowing smile.
Sophie, she was his first love, he said. His wartime love. A love born in the midst of chaos, of fear, of desperation. It was intense, passionate, but it was also a love of the past. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. What we have, he continued, is different. It's a love born in the aftermath, in the quiet spaces between the storms. It's a love of healing, of hope, of a future. Colette looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She realized that he was right. Their love was different. It wasn't a fiery, all-consuming passion, but a quiet, gentle flame, a source of warmth and comfort, a beacon of hope in the darkness. It was a love that had grown slowly, organically, out of shared experience, out of mutual respect and understanding. It was a love that could heal, that could restore, that could help them both move forward. It had none of Henri's frantic, desperate tone. "Jean-Pierre," she said, her voice filled with a newfound certainty. I want to try. I want to see where this goes." He smiled, a radiant smile that lit up his face. He gently pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. They stood there, embraced, on the banks of the Seine, the lights of Paris shimmering around them, the ghosts of the past fading into the background. It was not a love to replace the love of Sophie and Henri, but it was a love to honor them, to show that life continues. They had crossed the barricades of their hearts, the barriers of the past. They were ready to move on. Together. Chapter 14. The Raven's Warning. The burgeoning relationship between Colette and Jean-Pierre offered a fragile sense of normalcy, a respite from the tumultuous events surrounding Cunningham's arrest and the ongoing investigation. They spent their free time together, exploring Paris, rediscovering the city's beauty, slowly rebuilding their lives amidst the scars of war. However, the shadow of Cunningham and the secrets he had taken to his prison cell still lingered. One evening, as Colette and Jean-Pierre were enjoying a quiet dinner at a small bistro in Montmartre, they were interrupted by an unexpected visitor. A man, tall and imposing, with a stern face and piercing eyes, approached their table. He wore a dark suit, and his demeanor suggested authority, perhaps even a hint of menace. "Mademoiselle Dubois?" he said, his voice clipped and precise.
Jean-Pierre Dubois?
Colette and Jean-Pierre exchanged a nervous glance. They recognized the man's accent. British. "Yes," Colette replied, her voice hesitant. The man presented a card. "Detective Inspector Alistair Davies, Scotland Yard," he said. "I'm here in Paris as part of the investigation into Captain Cunningham's activities." Colette's heart pounded in her chest. She had anticipated that the British authorities would launch their own investigation, but she hadn't expected it to reach her so quickly, so directly. "What can we do for you, Inspector?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. Davies sat down at their table, uninvited, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing them. "I understand you were instrumental in exposing Captain Cunningham's treachery," he said. "We provided information," Colette replied, choosing her words carefully. "Evidence that proved his guilt." Davies nodded. "Indeed," he said. "And we are grateful for your assistance. However, the investigation is ongoing. There are certain aspects that remain unclear." He paused, his gaze focusing on Jean-Pierre. "Monsieur Dubois," he said. "You were a member of the resistance, I believe. You worked with Captain Cunningham." Jean-Pierre stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for Colette's under the table. He admitted. But I didn't know he was a traitor. I trusted him. Davy's expression remained impassive.
Of course, he said.
But you were close to him. You had access to sensitive information. I shared information with him, Jean-Pierre said. Information that I believed would help the Allied cause. I had no idea he was using it against us. Davies leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low murmur. There are rumors, he said. Whispers. That Captain Cunningham was not working alone. That he had accomplices. Within the resistance. Within the British military. Colette felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed from a Scotland Yard detective was unsettling. It suggested a conspiracy that reached far beyond Cunningham, that implicated others, perhaps even those in positions of power and authority. What are you suggesting, Inspector? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Davies looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and warning. I'm suggesting, he said, that you be careful, that you watch your backs. Captain Cunningham had powerful friends. Friends who might not want the truth to come out. Friends who might be willing to silence anyone who threatens them. He stood up, his gaze lingering on Colette and Jean-Pierre. I advise you, he said, to cooperate fully with our investigation. To tell us everything you know. And to be discreet. The less you say, the better. He turned and left, disappearing into the crowded bistro, leaving Colette and Jean-Pierre shaken and disturbed. The detective's words were a veiled threat, a warning that they were walking on dangerous ground, that they had stirred up a hornet's nest of secrets and lies. What does he mean? Colette whispered, her voice filled with fear. Who are these friends? Jean-Pierre shook his head, his face pale.
I don't know, he said.
But I have a bad feeling about this. Cunningham, he was connected. He had influence.
He could reach out.
Even from prison. They left the bistro, the unease settling upon them. As they walked back to Colette's apartment, they noticed a black raven perched on a lamppost, its beady eyes watching them, its presence ominous and unsettling. The bird let out a harsh croak, a sound that echoed in the silence of the night, a warning that seemed to confirm their fears. They were not safe. Cunningham's reach extended further than they had imagined, and his allies were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. They couldn't trust anyone. The black raven symbolized a bad omen and a warning to watch themselves. Chapter 15. A glimmer of hope in the darkness. The encounter with Detective Inspector Davies and the ominous warning symbolized by the raven cast a long shadow over Colette and Jean-Pierre. They felt exposed, vulnerable, aware that they were caught in a web of intrigue that extended far beyond their understanding. They knew they had to be careful, to watch their every step, to trust no one. Despite the fear and uncertainty, they refused to be intimidated. They had come too far, risked too much, to back down now. They were determined to uncover the full extent of Cunningham's conspiracy, to expose his accomplices, to ensure that justice was served. They decided to focus on the one lead they had, Henry's letters. They revisited the catacombs, seeking out Jacques, the silent guide who had led them to the secret archive. They needed his help again, his knowledge of the underground world, his connections to the hidden networks that still operated beneath the surface of Parisian society. Jacques, as always, was enigmatic, his face obscured by the shadows of his wide-brimmed hat. He listened to their story, his eyes unreadable, his silence both unnerving and reassuring. When they finished, he simply nodded, a single, subtle gesture that indicated his willingness to help. The raven speaks truth, he said, his voice a low murmur, barely audible above the drip, drip, drip of water in the tunnels. There is danger, but there is also hope. He led them through a different section of the catacombs, a network of tunnels they hadn't seen before. These tunnels were narrower, more claustrophobic, the air thicker with the scent of decay and damp earth. They felt like they were descending into the very bowels of the city, into a world where the past clung to the present like a shroud. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small, hidden chamber. Unlike the previous archive, this one was empty, devoid of crates or documents. It was a bare, stone room with a single, flickering candle illuminating the darkness. In the center of the room, there was a small, wooden table. On the table, there was a single object, a tarnished silver locket. Jacques gestured towards the locket. This, he said, belonged to Sophie Delacroix. Colette's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the locket from Henry's letters, from the description he had given of the gift he had given to Sophie, the token of his love, his promise of a future together. How did you get this? She asked, her voice trembling.
Jacques shrugged. It was found, he said.
In the possession of a German officer. After the liberation, Colette understood. The locket had been taken from Sophie, likely after her arrest, after her torture, after her death. It had been a trophy, a spoil of war, a symbol of Cunningham's treachery. She reached out and carefully picked up the locket. It was cold, heavy in her hand, a tangible link to Sophie, to her tragic fate, to the love that had been stolen from her. She opened the locket, revealing 2 miniature portraits, one of Sophie, her radiant smile captured in a faded photograph, and one of Henri, his young, haunted face, a stark contrast to Sophie's optimism. As Colette gazed at the portraits, she noticed something else. On the back of Sophie's portrait, there was a tiny inscription, barely visible, etched into the silver. She held the locket closer to the candle, squinting to make out the words. It was a name. Lord Ashworth. Lord Ashworth. The name meant nothing to Colette. But Jacques, who had been silently observing her, let out a low gasp. Ashworth, he whispered. He is powerful. A British nobleman. A politician. A spy master. A spy master. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Cunningham hadn't been working alone. He had been a pawn, a tool in a much larger game. A game orchestrated by Lord Ashworth, a man who pulled the strings from the shadows, a man who controlled the flow of information, a man who manipulated events for his own gain. We need to find him, Colette said, her voice firm, her determination renewed. We need to expose him.
Jacques nodded.
It will be dangerous, he said. Ashworth is protected. He has influence. He can make people disappear. I don't care, Colette replied. We have to try. We owe it to Sophie, to Henri, to everyone who suffered because of his treachery. Jacques looked at her, his eyes, for the first time, revealing a flicker of admiration, of respect. There is hope, he said, his voice a low murmur, a glimmer of light. In the darkness, they had a new direction, a solid lead. Ashworth was the next target. But Ashworth, with his resources and influence, was a challenge greater than Cunningham. He would be almost impossible to bring down. Chapter 16. The unfolding of the past. The discovery of Lord Ashworth's name, etched into the back of Sophie's locket, was a turning point. It provided a concrete target, a powerful figure who seemed to be the mastermind behind Cunningham's treachery and the wider conspiracy that had ensnared them. Colette and Jean-Pierre knew that confronting Ashworth would be even more dangerous than their encounter with Cunningham, but they were resolute. They began to research Ashworth, seeking any information they could find about his background, his connections, his activities. They discovered that he was a prominent member of the British aristocracy, a wealthy and influential landowner with close ties to the government and the intelligence services. He had served in various diplomatic posts, often in countries where espionage and covert operations were commonplace. He was known for his ruthlessness, his ambition, and his unwavering loyalty to the British Empire. Colette and Jean-Pierre realized that they couldn't confront Ashworth directly. They needed irrefutable proof of his involvement, evidence that would withstand scrutiny and expose his crimes to the world. They decided to return to London, to the heart of Ashworth's power base, to seek out allies and gather information. They traveled by train and ferry, crossing the English Channel, the gray, choppy waters mirroring the uncertainty and danger that lay ahead. London, in 1919, was a city still recovering from the war, a mixture of grandeur and decay, of hope and disillusionment. The city was bustling, filled with a sense of restless energy, a determination to rebuild and move forward, but the scars of the conflict were still visible in the bombed-out buildings, the the wounded soldiers, the faces etched with loss and grief. Colette and Jean-Pierre found lodgings in a small, unassuming hotel in Bloomsbury, a neighborhood known for its literary and intellectual circles. They began to explore the city, seeking out contacts, gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of Ashworth's life and activities. They visited libraries and archives, poring over old newspapers, parliamentary records, and diplomatic correspondence. They spoke to former intelligence officers, to journalists, to anyone who might have known Ashworth or had some insight into his dealings. They discovered that Ashworth had a reputation for secrecy, for operating in the shadows, for manipulating events from behind the scenes. He was a master of disguise, a chameleon who could blend into any environment, a man who left few traces, who covered his tracks meticulously. They also learned that Ashworth had a particular interest in France, that he had been involved in various covert operations during the war, including the recruitment and training of spies, the dissemination of propaganda, and the sabotage of enemy infrastructure. He had a network of informants and agents throughout France, including, they suspected, within the resistance. One evening, as they were reviewing their findings in their hotel room, they received a visit from an unexpected guest. A woman, elegant and sophisticated, with sharp eyes and a determined expression, knocked on their door. "Mademoiselle Dubois?" she said, her voice refined, her accent distinctly British.
Jean-Pierre Dubois?
Colette and Jean-Pierre exchanged a cautious glance. "Yes," Colette replied. The woman presented a card. "My name is Eleanor Davies," she said. "I'm Detective Inspector Davies' sister." Colette's heart skipped a beat. Davies, the Scotland Yard detective who had warned them in Paris, had a sister. And she was here in London seeking them out. What do you want?" Colette asked, her voice hesitant. Eleanor stepped into the room, her gaze sweeping over them, assessing them. "I know about my brother's visit to you in Paris," she said. "I know about his warning." "He told you?" Jean-Pierre asked, surprised. Eleanor shook her head.
"He didn't have to," she said.
"I know my brother. I know the kind of work he does. I know the dangers he faces." She paused, her gaze focusing on Colette. "I also know about Lord Ashworth," she said. "I know about his involvement in Captain Cunningham's treachery." Colette and Jean-Pierre were stunned. How could she know? Was she working with her brother? Was this a trap? How do you know?" Colette asked, her voice trembling.
Eleanor smiled, a sad, knowing smile.
"I've been investigating Ashworth for years," she said. "He's a dangerous man, a corrupt man. He's responsible for so much suffering, so much death." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary filled with meticulous notes, names, dates, events. "This is my evidence," she said. "My proof of Ashworth's crimes. I've been gathering it for years, waiting for the right moment to expose him." She handed the diary to Colette. "I believe we can help each other," she said. "Together we can bring him down." A new ally, in the most unexpected of forms. The sister of the man who had brought them a warning, now herself a beacon. Ashworth's crimes were catching up. Chapter 17. Crossroads of Duty and Desire. The alliance with Eleanor Davies, the sister of the Scotland Yard detective, opened a new chapter in Colette and Jean-Pierre's quest to expose Lord Ashworth. Eleanor's diary was a treasure trove of information, a meticulously documented record of Ashworth's clandestine activities, his network of spies, his involvement in various covert operations, his ruthless pursuit of power and influence. Eleanor, it turned out, was a journalist, a respected investigative reporter for a prominent London newspaper. She had been tracking Ashworth for years, driven by a personal vendetta. Her fiancé, a British intelligence officer, had been killed during the war, a victim of one of Ashworth's schemes. Eleanor had dedicated her life to uncovering the truth, to exposing Ashworth's crimes, to avenging her fiancé's death. Together, Colette, Jean-Pierre, and Eleanor began to piece together the final pieces of the puzzle. They discovered that Ashworth had been motivated not only by political ambition and personal gain, but also by a deep-seated hatred of France, a resentment stemming from a long-forgotten family feud, a rivalry that had spanned generations. He had used his position and influence to undermine the Franco-British alliance, to sow discord and mistrust between the two countries, to further his own twisted agenda. They also learned that Ashworth had been aware of Colette and Jean-Pierre's investigation, that he had been monitoring their movements, that he had sent Detective Inspector Davies to Paris not to warn them, but to intimidate them, to dissuade them from pursuing the truth. Davies, it seemed, was caught in the middle, torn between his duty to his superiors and his loyalty to his sister, his growing suspicion that Ashworth was a dangerous and corrupt man. As they delved deeper into Ashworth's past, Colette and Jean-Pierre found themselves increasingly drawn to each other. The shared danger, the shared purpose, the shared grief and hope had forged a bond between them that transcended mere friendship or camaraderie. They found solace in each other's company, a sense of comfort and understanding that helped them navigate the treacherous path they had chosen. One evening, as they were working late in Eleanor's apartment, reviewing the evidence, poring over the diary, the maps, the coded messages, Colette looked up and caught Jean-Pierre's gaze. He was watching her, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and longing, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken feelings that had grown between them. Jean-Pierre, Colette said, her voice hesitant, I need to talk to you. Jean-Pierre nodded, his expression mirroring her own uncertainty, her own vulnerability. They stepped out onto the small balcony, overlooking the quiet London street, the night air cool and crisp, the city lights twinkling in the distance. I know we've been focused on Ashworth, Colette began, her voice trembling slightly. On the investigation. But I can't ignore what's happening between us. Jean-Pierre reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a warm shiver through her. I know, he said. I feel it too, but I'm afraid. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to betray Henry's memory. Colette looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. You're not betraying him, she said. You're honoring him. By living. By loving. By finding happiness. She paused, her gaze searching his. I love you, Jean-Pierre, she said, the words tumbling out, a confession that had been building inside her for weeks, for months. I love you not as a replacement for Henri, but as yourself, as the man you are. Jean-Pierre's eyes widened, his expression a mixture of surprise and joy. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. I love you too. Colette, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I love you more than words can say. They kissed a long, tender kiss that sealed their love, that acknowledged the past but embraced the future, a promise of a life together, a life beyond the shadows of war, a life filled with hope and healing. But their moment of happiness was short-lived. As they stood there, embraced on the balcony, a shot rang out, shattering the silence of the night. Jean-Pierre gasped, his body jerking violently, his arms loosening their grip around Colette. He stumbled, his hand reaching for his chest, his eyes widening in pain and disbelief. Colette screamed, catching him as he fell, lowering him gently to the ground. She saw the blood, spreading rapidly across his shirt, staining her hands, her dress. She pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stem the flow, her mind racing, her heart pounding in terror.
Jean-Pierre, she cried.
Stay with me.
Please stay with me.
He looked at her, his eyes filled with love and regret, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Colette, he whispered. I love you. His eyes closed, his body went limp, his hand slipping from hers. He was gone. Colette cradled his lifeless body, her tears streaming down her face, her screams echoing in the empty night. Ashworth had struck again, his reach extending even across the channel, his cruelty and ruthlessness knowing no bounds. He had taken Jean-Pierre from her, just as he had taken Sophie from Henri, just as he had taken so many lives, so many dreams. The choice of loving and having it taken away in the same moment. The crossroads of the two emotions came too fast. The war had found a way, through Ashworth, to hurt her again. She looked up, knowing someone somewhere was watching. Chapter 18. The Ghosts of No Man's Land. Jean-Pierre's death was a devastating blow, a cruel twist of fate that left Colette reeling with grief and rage. She had lost another loved one, another victim of Ashworth's ruthless ambition, another casualty of the war that refused to end. She felt numb, empty, her heart shattered into a million pieces. Eleanor tried to comfort her, to offer her solace, but Colette was inconsolable. She blamed herself for Jean-Pierre's death, for bringing him into this dangerous world, for exposing him to Ashworth's wrath. She felt like she was cursed, that everyone she loved was destined to suffer, to die. The London police launched an investigation into Jean-Pierre's murder, but Colette had little faith in their ability to find the killer. She knew it was Ashworth's doing, a message, a warning, a demonstration of his power and reach. She knew she was next, that Ashworth wouldn't rest until she was silenced, until the truth about his crimes was buried forever. She considered giving up, returning to Paris, retreating from the fight. But she couldn't. She couldn't betray Jean-Pierre's memory. She couldn't let Ashworth win. She had to find a way to fight back, to expose him, to avenge Jean-Pierre's death, to honor the sacrifices of all those who had fallen victim to his treachery. She spent days and days, wandering the streets of London, haunted by the ghosts of the past, by the memories of Henri, of Sophie, of Jean-Pierre. She visited the war memorials, the cemeteries, the places where the names of the fallen were etched in stone, a silent testament to the cost of war, the price of freedom. One evening, as she was walking along the Thames, the river shrouded in a thick fog, she saw a figure standing on a bridge, silhouetted against the gray sky. It was a man, tall and thin, his posture familiar, his presence both comforting and unsettling. As she drew closer, she realized who it was. It was Henri. Colette stopped, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Henri was dead. He had died in the war, driven to madness by Sophie's betrayal, by his own guilt. She had read his letters. She had seen his grave in the catacombs. But here he was, standing before her, as real as the fog that swirled around him.
Henri?
She whispered, her voice trembling. The figure turned, his face emerging from the shadows. It was Henri, but he was different. He was older, his face lined with the scars of war, his eyes filled with a deep sadness, but also with a quiet strength, a sense of peace that she had never seen before. Colette, he said, his voice soft, his tone gentle. Colette rushed towards him, embracing him, tears streaming down her face. Henri, she cried. Is it really you? How is this possible? Henri held her tight, his arms comforting, his presence reassuring. It's a long story, he said. A story of survival, of redemption, of finding peace. He explained that he hadn't died in the war, that he had been rescued, nursed back to health, given a new identity, a new life. He had spent years wandering, searching for a way to escape the darkness, to atone for his perceived failures. He had eventually found solace in helping others, in working with the wounded, the forgotten, the victims of war. I know about Sophie, he said. I know about Cunningham. I know about Ashworth.
How?
Colette asked, bewildered.
Henri smiled, Assad, knowing smile.
The ghosts of no man's land, they whisper, he said.
They guide.
They protect. He explained that he had been following Colette's journey, that he had been watching over her, that he had known she would find the truth, that she would confront Ashworth. You're not alone, Colette, he said. I'm here to help you, to guide you, to protect you. Colette looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope. She had thought she had lost everyone she loved, but here was Henri, returned from the dead, a ghost made flesh, a beacon of light in the darkness. But Jean-Pierre, she said, her voice choked with grief.
He's gone.
Ashworth killed him. Henri nodded, his eyes filled with sadness. I know, he said, and I grieve for him. But his death will not be in vain. We will avenge him. We will expose Ashworth. We will bring him to justice. Together, Colette and Henri, reunited by fate, by the ghosts of the past, prepared to face Ashworth, to confront the darkness, to fight for justice, for peace, for a future free from the shadows of war. Henri alive, was a shocking turn, but a welcome one. The Ghosts of No Man's Land was a reference to the battlefield, but also a place of meeting between the living and the dead. Chapter 19. A Rendezvous Beyond the Veil. The reappearance of Henri, a ghost returned from the mists of the past, infused Colette with a renewed sense of purpose and a fierce determination. She was no longer alone in her fight against Ashworth. She had a powerful ally, a man who had survived the horrors of war, who understood the darkness they were facing, who shared her grief and her rage. Together, Colette and Henri, with Eleanor's assistance, devised a plan to expose Ashworth. They knew they couldn't confront him directly. He was too powerful, too well protected. They needed to find a way to lure him out, to expose his crimes to the public, to force the authorities to take action. They decided to use the upcoming unveiling of a new war memorial, a monument dedicated to the memory of the fallen soldiers, as their opportunity. Ashworth, as a prominent member of the British aristocracy and a supposed war hero, was scheduled to attend the ceremony, to deliver a speech, to bask in the glow of public admiration. It was the perfect setting for their confrontation, a place where his carefully constructed facade would be most vulnerable. Eleanor, using her contacts in the media, arranged for a prominent journalist, a respected investigative reporter known for his integrity and his fearlessness, to be present at the ceremony. She provided him with copies of her diary, with Henry's letters, with all the evidence they had gathered against Ashworth. She instructed him to publish the story, to expose Ashworth's crimes to the world, at the precise moment when Colette and Henri confronted him. Colette and Henri, meanwhile, prepared for their final showdown with Ashworth. They knew it would be dangerous, that Ashworth would likely have his own security detail, that he wouldn't hesitate to use violence to protect himself. But they were ready. They had come too far, lost too much, to back down now. On the day of the unveiling ceremony, Colette and Henri arrived at the memorial site early, blending in with the crowd of dignitaries, military officers, and members of the public. The atmosphere was somber, respectful, the air filled with a mixture of grief and pride, of remembrance and hope. They spotted Ashworth, standing near the monument, surrounded by his entourage, his face a mask of solemn dignity, his demeanor exuding power and authority. He looked untouchable, a man above reproach, a pillar of British society. As the ceremony began, Colette and Henri moved closer to Ashworth, their hearts pounding in their chests, their hands clutching the evidence that would expose his crimes. They waited for the right moment, for the signal from Eleanor, for the journalist to release the story. As Ashworth stepped forward to deliver his speech, Colette and Henri made their move. They pushed through the crowd, confronting him, their voices raised, their accusations ringing out across the silent assembly. "Lord Ashworth," Colette cried, "you are a traitor, a murderer,
A spy."
Henri stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Ashworth, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "You betrayed Sophie Delacroix," he said. "You betrayed your country. You destroyed so many lives." Ashworth stared at them, his face paling, his eyes widening in disbelief and rage. He tried to dismiss them, to order his security detail to remove them, but it was too late. The journalist had released the story, the news spreading like wildfire through the crowd, through the city, through the world. Eleanor's diary, Henry's letters, the evidence of Ashworth's treachery, were now public knowledge. His crimes were exposed, his lies revealed, his carefully constructed facade shattered. The crowd erupted in chaos, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and outrage. The dignitaries distanced themselves from Ashworth, the military officers looked on in disgust, the members of the public turned against him, their admiration replaced by contempt. Ashworth, cornered, exposed, his power and influence crumbling around him, tried to defend himself, to deny the accusations, but his words rang hollow, his denials unconvincing. He was finished. The police arrived, arresting Ashworth, taking him into custody, his reign of terror finally over. Colette and Henri watched him go, their hearts filled with a mixture of grief and satisfaction, of pain and relief. They had avenged Sophie, Jean-Pierre, and all those who had suffered at Ashworth's hands. They had brought him to justice. As the crowd dispersed, Colette and Henri stood before the war memorial, the names of the fallen etched in stone, a silent testament to the cost of war, the price of freedom. They were surrounded by ghosts, by the spirits of those who had perished, by the memories of those they had loved and lost. It was time for a final farewell, a proper burial, and peace. But they were not alone. They had each other. And they had found, amidst the chaos and the darkness, a glimmer of hope, a promise of a future free from the shadows of the past. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. With Ashworth's arrest and the exposure of his crimes, a sense of closure, albeit a bittersweet one, settled over Colette and Henri. The long, arduous journey, fraught with danger, loss, and heartbreak, had finally reached its end. Justice had been served, the ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, and the future, though uncertain, held a glimmer of hope. However, the reckoning of their intertwined destinies was not yet complete. Henri, though alive and free, still carried the weight of his past, the scars of war, the guilt of perceived failures. He had found peace in helping others, in dedicating his life to healing the wounded, but he still struggled to forgive himself, to accept the possibility of personal happiness. Colette, too, carried her own burdens, the grief of losing Jean-Pierre, the lingering trauma of the war, the fear of opening her heart to love again. She had found solace in Henry's return, in his strength and his compassion, but she was hesitant to embrace a future that seemed both fragile and uncertain. They decided to return to Paris, to the city where their journey had begun, to the place where they had both found and lost love, to the scene of their shared triumphs and tragedies. They visited the cathedral, Notre Dame, where Colette had first found the glowing script, the message that had set them on this path. They stood before the stained glass windows, the sunlight filtering through the colored panes, casting a kaleidoscope of light and shadow on the ancient stone floor. It all started here, Colette said, her voice soft, her eyes reflecting the memories of the past. With a message, a promise. Henri nodded, his gaze fixed on the altar, his expression a mixture of reverence and regret. "Find peace in chaos," he whispered, the words echoing in the vast, empty space. It seemed impossible at the time. "But you found it," Colette said. "You helped others find it. You saved lives." Henri looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "But I couldn't save Sophie," he said. "I couldn't save Jean-Pierre." Colette reached out and gently took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You did everything you could," she said. You were a hero. You fought for what you believed in." "But I made mistakes," Henri said. I trusted the wrong people. I let them down." Colette squeezed his hand, her gaze unwavering. "We all make mistakes," she said. "We all carry burdens. But we can't let the past define us. We have to move forward. We have to find a way to heal." They left the cathedral, walking hand in hand through the streets of Paris, the city slowly rebuilding, slowly recovering from the wounds of war. They visited the cemetery where Jean-Pierre was buried, placing flowers on his grave, honoring his memory, remembering his sacrifice. "He loved you, Colette," Henri said, his voice choked with emotion. He was a good man. A brave man." Colette nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she whispered. "And I loved him too." They stood there, in silence, for a long time, their hearts heavy with grief, but also with a sense of gratitude, of appreciation for the love they had shared, for the time they had had together. As they turned to leave, Henri stopped, his gaze fixed on a small, unassuming headstone, a grave that had been overlooked, forgotten. It was the grave of Marcel Dubois, Madame Elise's brother, the man who had betrayed Sophie, the man who had caused so much pain and suffering. Henri knelt down, placing a single flower on the grave, a gesture of forgiveness, of compassion, of understanding. "He was a victim too," Henri said, his voice barely a whisper. "A pawn in a larger game. A man consumed by weakness. By fear." Colette looked at him, her eyes filled with admiration. She realized that Henri had truly found peace, that he had transcended the bitterness and the hatred, that he had embraced forgiveness and compassion, that he had found a way to heal, not only himself, but also the wounds of the past. They walked away from the cemetery, their steps lighter, their hearts filled with a sense of hope, of renewal. They had faced the darkness, they had confronted the ghosts of the past, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, more resilient. They had a final duty to perform, a promise to fulfill. They walked towards the hospital where Colette had met the man she'd come to know as Henri, where the two scripts would finally find their place. The reckoning was over. Epilogue. The hospital, bathed in the soft, golden light of a late afternoon sun, felt familiar and comforting to Colette. It was here that her journey had truly begun, here that she had first encountered the echoes of Henri's past, here that she had tended to the wounded and the forgotten, here that she had found a purpose, a calling, a way to make sense of the chaos of war. She and Henri walked hand in hand through the familiar corridors, the scent of antiseptic and disinfectant mingling with a faint aroma of flowers, the sounds of hushed voices and quiet footsteps creating a symphony of healing and hope. They reached the small, unassuming room where Monsieur Dubois, the medic, had spent his final days, the room where he had revealed the truth about Cunningham, the room where he had shared his memories of Henri. The room was empty now, the bed stripped bare, the walls scrubbed clean, but the echoes of the past still lingered, the whispers of the ghosts who had sought refuge and solace within these walls. Colette felt a sense of peace, of closure, a feeling that they had come full circle, that they had returned to the place where it had all begun. Henri reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the two scripts, the one Colette had found in the cathedral, glowing with an ethereal light, and the one Jean-Pierre had given her, filled with Henri's wartime confessions. He placed them side by side on the small, wooden table, the two versions of his life, the two paths he had taken, the two destinies that had converged in this moment. "I don't need these anymore," Henri said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a quiet serenity. "They belong here, with the memories, with the ghosts." Colette nodded, understanding. The scripts had served their purpose. They had guided them. They had revealed the truth. They had brought them together. Now it was time to let them go, to release them to the past, to allow them to become part of the hospital's history, a testament to the enduring power of love, of hope, of healing. They left the scripts on the table, turning to leave, their hearts filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief, of sadness and joy. As they reached the doorway, Colette paused, looking back at the room, at the two scripts, bathed in the soft, golden light. She noticed something, a subtle shift, a change in the atmosphere. The glowing script, the one she had found in the cathedral, had dimmed, its ethereal light fading, becoming less intense, less vibrant. And the other script, the one Jean-Pierre had given her, the one filled with Henri's wartime confessions, had begun to glow, faintly at first, then stronger, brighter, radiating a soft, golden light. Colette smiled, a knowing smile, a smile of understanding and acceptance. The two scripts had merged, their energies combined, their stories intertwined, their destinies fulfilled. They had become one, a single testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in the darkness, a promise of a future free from the shadows of war. She and Henri walked out of the hospital, hand in hand, into the warm embrace of the setting sun, their hearts filled with love, with peace, with a quiet joy that transcended words. They had found each other. They had found their way back to life. They had found a future they would face together, a future filled with hope, with healing, with the promise of a love that would endure, a love that would conquer all. Colette and Henri walked to their future, leaving the scripts and the hospital behind. The past was behind them, and they were ready to live. The two scripts, now one, would be a testament to their journey, to their love, to the era that changed their lives. The end.